got this information from the Pier 21 in Halifax, and they showed me that the ship that we came on was called the Gutenberg. And when I came onto that ship in Rotterdam, we didn't really, you don't know where you're going or what you're getting into or anything like that. You just spent a couple of days on a train going from Denmark, and then we had to go through, because at that time in 1953, I think it was Europe had hoof and mouth, probably some of these other diseases that the animals get now. So we had to walk with our shoes through water before we stepped on the ship. That was one of the things that, yeah, with disinfectant. And so you get on the ship, which is very exciting. And but then there was my mother and myself, and my brother was 16, and I was 13, and my little sister was only 3. And we went on the ship. But this was an immigration ship. In those days, they actually had ships that were taking the immigrants over to Canada and I guess Australia and all the other places that people were immigrating to after the Second World War. And so this ship had been converted. So if you take a cruise ship, this was much smaller than a cruise ship, but if you take a ship with a cabin in it, instead of having a cabin for 2 people, in order to get more people on there, they would put bunk beds up in the room. So my brother had to go on the men's side, and we were with, I think, 6 or 8 other women in these bunk beds in this little wee cabin for all the time. And you know, it's just so strange how, well, it wasn't quite the Titanic, but in that crowd, when you see how the poor people got into that kind of thing, it was a totally different way of how they did that, you know, and how small. But we got here. that was the least affordable way to get here. That was what people did in those days, right? Yeah. I think that me coming in 1953, but then I think of my mother going the other way, how difficult it would have been for her to leave her family in Canada and having to go to Denmark. And I don't think, you know, just like there are people here that don't like immigrants, I think it's all over the world. We're not unique, and sadly, we're not unique in that. So I think she had a very difficult time fitting into Denmark, and so she always wanted to come home, but she couldn't speak the language, and her family wasn't there, and so forth. You know, so yeah, I think it was much more difficult for her to go that way than it was for us to go back later.
Well, you at least had family to speak to.
I know, like
she wouldn't have anybody to speak to.
Exactly. I think she was very lonely and isolated there, you know. So, and then with the war and the difficulty in just surviving in the war, you know, it was, although Denmark wasn't really bombed like Holland and England and stuff like that, we were occupied, and there were bombs. Actually, when during the war, my older brothers, they took the children out of Copenhagen, and all the farmers would shelter the children. And so, first of all, the schools, the Germans had taken their families and put them in the schools. And so it was difficult for children to go to school. So farmers would say, send us your children, and then they went to school. So my mother had to give up her children to go to the countryside and but I was too young to go, so I stayed home. But my brother tells some stories because my oldest brother was 10 years older than I was. So basically, when they would say, for example, when I was 3, he would be 13, and so they went and they would go to families that they didn't know either. But the interesting thing was, and so my older brother tells a story about how one of my brothers, Denmark is made up of a peninsula where Jutland, Sjælland, and
Islands.
and a couple of islands. So one of my brothers stayed on the same island where Copenhagen is, but my other brothers went over to Jutland on the ferries. So he was in charge of my younger brother, because if he was, let's say if he was 13, Alpha would probably only be about 8 or 9. And in the middle of a train station, they were bombed. And my brother said that he was going to try and run out of the train station where they were trying to, because these trains carried all the children, and they were worried about the children. And he was going to try and escape, but of course somebody made him, and they eventually came to the place where they were supposed to be. But one of the interesting things also is that those farm places that took in the children became their second family. My brothers knew those until the day they died. My oldest brother, just prior, a few years ago, went back to the family where he stayed as a little child, and they would go there during the summer holidays each year. Each one of my brothers would go back to those families for their summer holidays, so they became part of the family. Interesting.